Many of us are worried about the future generation, what's going on with our school systems, LGBTQ, parent choice. Is Trump going to revamp the school system, or is Joe Biden going to stay in and keep the status quo? To help me with that, I have Dr. Corey DeAngelis with me. Dr. DeAngelis, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I got to correct you real quick. I'm not a real doctor. I'm more like a Jill Biden doctor. I got a PhD in education policy.
Hey, every PhD I know still goes by doctor, so we're
right.
happy to have you. But we're not going to ask you any questions about Dr. Fauci or surgery or anything like that. I do have a lot of parents and grandparents that watch my show on a regular basis. Like me, I believe that they are worried about these agendas being pushed on children, especially young children. The fact that children seem to be graduating with less of an education. So I want to jump into that. But I've been reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Democrat Party largely has a chokehold on the American schooling system. Democrats give school unions billions and billions of taxpayer dollars. And then a huge percentage of that, most people don't really know where that money goes. It's certainly not into investing in teachers, increasing their pay, finding the very best educators out there. And then these school unions pressure their teachers to vote Democrat. To me, this seems like a very toxic cycle.
It is a never-ending cycle of money laundering. Guess where that money goes? After it goes back into the government school system to the teachers unions, they give it back to the Democrat campaign coffers. And you can find this on Open Secret's website. You can look at where money goes. You can look up the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten's union. She fought to keep the schools closed as long as possible during the COVID era. In 2022, 99.97% of her campaign contributions from AFT, guess what? They went to Democrats. And it's been like that for decades, over 99% continuously being funneled back to Democrat campaign coffers. And that's the only reason why you have the Democrat politicians fighting tooth and nail against school choice. Democrat voters, Republican voters, independent voters. It's not a partisan issue among voters. The problem is the Democratic Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers unions, and so they fight as hard as possible against the status quo, against any change to the status quo in the form of school choice. And so that's a huge problem. And look, they've had a monopoly on the money. I mean, look, you live in one place in America and you're assigned to a school just based on where you live. It causes a lot of monopoly power. You can't go anywhere else without having to pay twice, once through the tax system, then again out of pocket to go to a private school. Or in some cases, families have moved houses to try to get into better so-called public schools. And the monopoly on money is just one half of the issue. The other part is that the radical left has figured out that they can have a monopoly on the minds of other people's children using the government-run school system that they've infiltrated for decades. They don't even have to have their own kids anymore, and they can still shape the direction of this country by molding the minds of other people's children for 13 years of their lives, for 7 hours a day. Conservatives, independents, and rational Democrats can't fight against that just by having more kids. You can't just outpopulate them. This is much deeper than the problems of Hollywood and social media, because we're dealing with young, impressionable minds, and they're going through government systems to learn that big government and socialism is the solution to all of their problems. And by the way, they're learning all of the gender ideology, Marxist critical race theory. They're dividing each other based on immutable characteristics, and that leads to a more politically polarized society, and it confuses kids too.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine how confusing it would be. I guess now this helps me understand. I guess I am going to talk to you about Dr. Fauci. I never understood, based off the science, why they were closing down these school systems, because children had almost no vulnerability to COVID. We now know that the 6 feet distancing was made up. We now know that the masks, unless they are a perfectly placed N95 mask that's replaced every 2 hours or less, it does nothing for us. We were all bamboozled,
That's right.
but it makes sense now if Democrats have a chokehold on the school system and Democrats flock to the vaccine, they flock to the mask, they flock to all of whatever Dr. God Fauci said. Now it makes more sense why our children were manipulated, abused with fear, kicked out of school, forced to do homeschool. What are your thoughts on all of that?
They weren't following the science. They were following the political science. If you looked at when Congress was debating school reopenings, the teachers unions campaign donations spiked to Democrats. So of course, they were holding children's education hostage to secure billions of dollars in ransom payments from taxpayers. It had nothing to do with safety or the needs of kids. It had everything to do with politics and power dynamics. If you looked, I did one of the first studies on this subject. It's now published in a peer-reviewed journal called Social Science Quarterly. I was the first researcher to link the school closures to teachers union influence. All else equal, even after you controlled for the incidence of the virus, population density, a whole host of other characteristics, all else equal, stronger teachers unions, a higher likelihood of your school remaining shuttered for longer periods of time. Since then, there have been at least 5 other studies finding the same results with different time periods, different methods, different data sets. The teachers unions were the ones who induced the school closures because they knew if the schools were closed, they could ask for all these other goodies and more money as leverage. They could say, we need more funding, but they also overplayed their hand. In Los Angeles, for example, in the report on reopening schools, we knew they were going to ask for more money. They did that, but they also called for a Medicare for all, a wealth tax, police-free schools, a ban on charter schools. These things had nothing to do with reopening the schools. In Chicago, they were so pathetic. They created an interpretive dance video to protest going back to work. They had a board member vacationing in Puerto Rico, thousands of miles away, while saying, oh, no, we can't go back to work. It's too unsafe. Well, then why are you traveling 2,000 miles away if you're so scared of your own shadow and you're so scared of going anywhere? Why would you go on vacation? In Los Angeles, in a private Facebook group, they were instructing their members that if you're going to go on vacation, that's fine, but don't post about it because it's going to blow up in their face. They knew they were being hypocrites. In Chicago, going back over there, they deleted a tweet, their official union account, saying, quote, "The push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny." The private schools were open. Everything, private businesses were fighting to reopen, but the government school teachers unions were fighting to remain closed. So much was the case, it was so obvious in Sacramento County in California. There was a lot of stupid health orders when it came to COVID. It didn't make any sense. But this one was especially egregious. They had a stupid health order that arbitrarily closed schools, but not daycares, because COVID was smart. It knew if you were learning something in the same building, it was going to activate and it was going to get you. But if you were just sitting there in the same building, twiddling your thumbs and not learning a thing, well, then it was gonna let you go because you were in a daycare and not a school. But there was a private Christian school in Sacramento County, saw this for the BS that it was, and they actually, guess what they did? They rebranded themselves as a daycare. They trained all their employees as daycare workers and said, I know that the schools are supposed to be closed, but we're actually a daycare doing learning on the side. It just goes to show you the private sector had an incentive to open to meet the needs of their families, because if they didn't, they would be closed for good. Whereas the government schools, of course they got their same paychecks. They had job security. They weren't worried about losing their jobs, but they also knew they could profit from the closures. They gave $190 billion in so-called COVID relief to K through 12 government schools. And that's more than the U.S. dedicated in the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. In real terms, this is a lot of money. And guess what? They didn't use it to open the schools. They used it to hire more people. It's a jobs program for adults, not an education initiative for kids. But the good news, as I lay out in the Parent Revolution, is that the parents are finally winning. They are pissed off, and they've seen the gender ideology, the Marxist ideology in the classrooms, and said something's going on here. They saw through Zoom school that things weren't all okay like they thought that they were. And so they pushed for change. They went to the school board meetings. We saw how well that worked out. The school boards cut off their mic, labeled them as domestic terrorists, sent a letter to the Biden administration implying that under the Patriot Act of all things, the federal government should be mobilized to label parents as domestic terrorists. It was an attempt to bully and silence parents into submission. And they basically sent a message. They said, you better sit down and shut up and do what you're told. But thankfully, you don't mess with mama bears and papa bears. You don't mess with their cubs. And parents awakened like a sleeping giant like we'd never seen before. And now we have 12 states, 12 since 2021, with universal school choice. Everybody can take their money where they want, public, private, or otherwise. And that is a huge win. It's a silver lining.
Yeah, that is huge. While we're on that topic, help me and my community understand, what is school choice? How does the money that taxpayers and property taxes goes into these huge trusts? How does that benefit the children? How does it benefit the cities? All of that.
Yeah, and the current status quo, we spend about $20,000 per student per year in the government-run schools that families are typically assigned to, which again creates a lot of monopoly power. If you don't like what you're getting in that system, you got to move houses or you got to pay twice. And what other industry do we do that? Just imagine if your grocery store didn't have any food on the shelves like we see in socialist countries, or the grocery store was serving you food that was expired and you were getting food poisoning each week. If you couldn't do anything about it, but you had to move houses if you wanted to get to a better grocery store, the grocery store would have zero incentive to do a better job. They would just continue shifting the blame elsewhere. They'd say, we just need more money. It's a definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again. And we do that with the school system, expecting different results. Since 1970, after adjusting for inflation, we've increased per student funding in the government schools by about 170%. Have the outcomes gotten 170% better? Obviously not. It's a bottomless pit, and you might as well be lighting that money on fire because it doesn't make its way into the classroom. It goes towards administrators of all things, people who don't really add that much to the educational experience. Since 2000, the number of students in the K-12 system has increased by about 7%, but the number of administrators in the system increased by about 90%. 90%. It is insane how much waste is embedded into the current status quo. But that's because they're a monopoly. They don't have to spend the dollars wisely. And in fact, if they fail, they can use that as an argument as to why they need more. It's insane, like how it's set up. But with school choice, that changes the power dynamic altogether. Instead of it being all about the system, the system finally has an incentive to cater to the needs of parents and students, the customers. The money follows the child. So that $20,000 or so, a portion of that can follow the student to a private school if you want. You can take it to a charter school, or you can take the money to cover homeschooling expenses too. And states like Arizona do this already. So in Arizona, they spend about $14,000 per kid in the government schools. The state portion, families have a decision that they can take the state portion, which is half of the total. It's about $7,000 per kid in Arizona. You can still keep your kid in the public school if you want. If you like your public school, you can keep your public school. But for real this time, unlike with your doctor, Obama. And the public schools do get better in response to competition. They actually do a better job when they have to compete for those dollars. But in Arizona, if you don't like the public school for whatever reason, that money goes to a savings account directed by the parent, and you can use it for private school tuition and fees. And the median private school tuition in Arizona is about $7,000 per year. It's lower cost than in other areas of the country. That's probably why their government school spending is lower than the national average. But you could also use it for homeschooling expenses like curriculum, a private tutor, and so on and so forth. So that is the basic nuts and bolts of school choice. And what typically happens is it's a rising tide that lifts all boats. The public schools improve. And there are 29 studies on this subject over time. 26 of the 29 find positive effects, more school choice, better outcomes in the public schools. We see this in Florida as one example. In Florida, they've expanded school choice for decades. Most recently, last year, they went all in. Everybody can take their money where they want. No more picking winners and losers. Everybody can do so. And in Florida, there are 11 studies there, 10 of them positive. And if you just look at the trends over time, a couple decades ago, Florida was horrible on the nation's report card, the national exam where you can compare across states. Horrible, at the bottom of the pack. Fast forward to today, they're ranked 1 on the US News and World Report for education, but on the nation's report card, they're in the top handful of states too, after you adjust for differences in student demographics across states to make apples to apples comparisons. And guess what? They spend far less than the national average. So it's not a money issue, it's an incentive issue. And Florida's public schools opened just about before most of the other states, maybe because they had school choice and an incentive to do so, and their unions didn't have as much leverage in Florida as they did in other states. The unions actually sued DeSantis to try to keep the schools closed in Florida. Thankfully, they lost because we live in laboratories of democracy. We're able to point to Florida and say, things are okay. They opened. And things were okay. So they were able to show other states like, hey, your fear-mongering isn't coming true. I mean, in D.C., where I was living at the time, the government school unions, get this, they put out fake body bags outside the public school offices to protest going back to work. Fake body bags. Like, what is wrong with these people? I mean, you had fake coffins and tombstones. In Arizona, even, they were instructing their members, the unions, to send letters to Governor Ducey, who was pro-school choice, pro-opening the schools. They were encouraging them to write fake obituaries to send to Governor DeSantis. It's just no other industry did this. Nobody else did this. And I don't really blame the people as much as I blame the incentives that are baked into the system look, you could keep your job without having to go to work, and you could actually get more money from keeping the doors closed. And then just the constant fear-mongering from the union bosses didn't help at all either.
Yeah, well, that was one thing that really bothered me. When you start treating little kids like they are the rats that carried the bubonic plague, something is wrong with you. Gratefully, I live in Utah, where we reopened in May of 2020. We dealt with COVID fairly well. We didn't have all of the mandates, and our children went to school with no masks. But in my community, I was reading the notes about what was this pressure being put on children. I was talking to people in Atlanta, Los Angeles, and they were treating these kids like they were cesspools of disease. Shame on those people, and now we know better, so we should just move forward. But we can never be tricked again.
They were even pushing the vaccines on kids, and then they were cutting the line, having the teachers get the vaccines first. But then when the teachers got the vaccines, they still didn't open. They would just change. It was constant moving the goalpost. And so, like, when Randy Weingarten went before Congress, the union boss, she closes her replies on Twitter like she closed the schools, but she's gotten slapped with community notes over and over again because she's trying to rewrite history. And part of the book is a recounting of the facts of what happened, all of the fear-mongering that happened. They lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools. She went before Congress and gaslighted the American public, saying that they were fighting to reopen the schools in April of 2020, of all things. No, they weren't. If they were, why were they closed? What they were doing was redefining what it meant to open the schools, and they'd say we're safely reopening, and what that meant was you got to give us $200 billion first, and oh, by the way, you got to do all these things that we know is never going to happen anytime soon, knowing full well they weren't going to, and no other industry did this. No other industry needed all of these billions and billions of dollars in so-called relief in order to open. The other industries said, you know what, I better open soon. And in fact, the private schools, when they were ordered to close in different states, like in Kentucky, they have a Democrat governor over there who supported the school closures, Andy Beshears. They sued the government for the right to open. It's just so crazy. Like like when the public schools closed, they cheered because they got more money. When the private schools were forced to close, they sued the government to say, hell no, we got to be able to open. This is all a farce. This is such BS. And Sweden had their schools open. The kids were fine over there. We had so much evidence at the time when all of this was going on that kids were at the lowest risk category for problems with the COVID virus. Yet they were still in DC. Even I think it was 2021, they were telling kids in order to go back to school, you had to get the vaccine. And data came out right after that showing that this was going to cause Black kids in particular to not be able to go back to school because they were just looking at the vaccine rates. And a lot of the white kids had the vaccine already at a certain age, but the Black kids disproportionately did not have the vaccine. And so they were basically ready to segregate society by telling Black kids in particular, you can't go to school because for whatever reason, you were less likely to get the vaccine. And so thankfully, they pushed the vaccine requirement back further once this data came out. But it shouldn't even require that kind of data to come out. It should just be the parents should be able to decide. These are their kids. We had data showing low risk of the virus for kids. We had data and evidence showing the private schools being open, things were fine. The daycares were open, things were fine. But all of this lunacy, yes, we lived through it. It was horrible. It hurt kids in a lot of ways. It hurt society in a lot of ways. It hurt businesses in a lot of ways. And it wasn't just academics. It was social. It was mental health issues with kids. Teenage suicides were spiking at the time. There was a lot of problems. In places like Chicago, 2 weeks to slow the spread, it turned into 2 years to flatten a generation. They were striking in 2022. So get out of here with that garbage saying that you were fighting to open the schools. You weren't. You were fighting to close them because you didn't care about the kids. You cared about yourself more than anybody else. But thankfully, if there is any silver lining to all of this, it's that parents have finally got a glimpse into the classroom. And though the schools are open, the problems are still there. And parents are never going to unsee what they saw in 2020. So they've been mobilized like never before, and the momentum has not slowed down.
Yeah. I genuinely believe that if the Black community could see behind the curtain at the way that they were manipulating them, shaming them, harassing them, gaslighting them, they would never vote Democrat again. It was such blatant racist manipulation. It's disgusting. And I'm glad that as a community, for the most part, they stood up to the government on this, but they should never be voting Democrat ever again. That's a total side note. But one thing I did want to talk to you about is, you mentioned, almost a 200% increase in the amount of funding. Yet I read that children in Baltimore can barely read. They can't do basic math. They are not setting these kids up for success. So what is the answer? I don't know how to be helpful to other parts of the country that are obviously being caught in the middle of a power struggle, not an empowerment struggle.
Right. And in Baltimore, they have 40% of their high schools with 0% proficiency rates in math. Not a single kid proficient in math. And 40% of their high school, dozens of high schools with 0%. It's insane how far it's gone wrong, how bad things have been, partially because of the union-induced school closures. There's decades of learning loss that will never be recovered, and it's their own dang fault. But to get more to the point of your question is, how do we get more empowerment in bluer areas? Because right now, it's true, we have a revolution happening in red states. It's really become a GOP litmus test issue. When the parents saw the lefty indoctrination in the schools, they started holding politicians accountable, and the Republicans who were voting against their own party platform, they were held accountable. In my home state of Texas, we passed universal school choice last year in the Senate, 18-13, easy. Moved over to the House, 21 so-called Republicans joined all the Democrats and voted against school choice and ultimately killed the bill. But guess what? The primaries just happened, and out of those 21, 14 of them are gone. A political earthquake. I mean, that never happens. Incumbents usually win re-election 95% of the time. That trend was inverted in Texas. We now, for the first time in history in the Texas House, have the votes for universal school choice. It's going to happen. We picked up 14 votes. That's insane. We needed 13. We might flip some of the Democrat house, seats as well in the general election. We'll see what happens. But once Texas comes along on universal school choice, more states will follow. And again, we live in laboratories of democracy. If more red states come along, Democrat states will see the benefits. They'll be less likely to be able to fearmonger. They won't be able to say that the schools are being destroyed because we'll have so much evidence showing the public schools do get better. We'll have even more evidence than we have today. And if the GOP picks up seats on this issue, like we saw in Virginia, remember in 2021, Mr. Terry, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. McAuliffe, the former governor of Virginia, a Democrat, he was running in a state that apparently went 10 points to Biden the year before. He lost after he said that on the final debate stage to Glenn Youngkin, a Republican. He won on the issue of education by 6 points with education voters. And that was the number 2 issue in that election. A Republican winning on education, that usually does not happen because before the conversations about education were about which party is going to throw more money at the problem. That was kind of the end of the day. And those people got the education vote. But since Glenn Youngkin, he was not a blip in the map. It wasn't just a one-time thing. There have been 2 big polls conducted by, of all places, the Democrats for Education Reform, not a right-leaning group.
Yeah.
They conducted a poll in battleground states and one in battleground congressional districts. Both of them finding that Democrats have lost their decades-long double-digit advantage on the issue of education. So Republicans should be running on this issue just like Glenn Youngkin did all across the country if they want to win. And the side benefit for everyday citizens is that if one party becomes a first mover and wins on an issue, the other party needs to come along too. They'll have an incentive to do so. They'll have pressure to actually listen to voters as opposed to special interest. And so we've seen some of those wins shifting towards the side of parents, even in bluer areas. So in North Carolina and in Georgia, these are red states controlled by Republicans, but they've had Democrats defect on the issue. Sitting legislators in both states have switched from the Democrat Party to the Republican Party on the issue of school choice. And in 2022, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, he started getting hit by his opponent, Doug Mastriano, the Republican. Doug said, look, Josh, look, you're a hypocrite. You went to private school, but you don't support school choice for others. Why is that? Right after that, coincidentally, Josh Shapiro slipped into his education platform, private school choice. It was a smart political decision. He was able to take that accusation of hypocrisy away from Doug. And at the same time, he was also able to signal support to voters in Pennsylvania who overwhelmingly support school choice. There are tens of thousands of families using private school choice in Pennsylvania already. And so he didn't alienate them as well. And I think the reason that he did this, it probably wasn't a true change of heart. He was probably reading the tea leaves. He was probably looking over to Virginia and saying, I don't want a Terry McAuliffe moment to happen to me. I don't want to lose on this issue, even though I'm up by double digits in the polls. It reminds me of something that Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist, once famously said. He said, the way that you change things is not by getting the right people into office. Obviously, that helps if they vote for the right things. But in the long run, the way that you truly change things is by creating a climate of opinion where it becomes politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And I think we're getting to that moment of escape velocity where it's becoming political suicide for politicians to stomp on parental rights and education. And this happened in Florida as well. DeSantis won by 20 points in 2022. We all know that. But in 2018, he barely won. Not a lot of people remember this. But he barely won by a fraction of a point against Andrew Gillum, a Democrat who called to get rid of the state's school choice program that was already serving over 100,000 kids, who was serving disproportionately low income and non-white kids. The headline in the Wall Street Journal the next day was that school choice moms tipped the governor's race in Florida. They were talking about CNN exit polling, of all things, that showed that black moms in particular came out in force for DeSantis because his opponent was going to rip away their scholarships. And so the story there is that these families who might not have agreed with DeSantis on a lot of other issues turned school choice into a single issue vote. They wanted their kids to get a better opportunity, a better education, and than they previously had when they were younger. And so this isn't just the right thing to do. That's obvious. It's not a partisan issue. It's also a political winner. And if Democrats are smart, they'll look at this thing that happened in Florida. They'll look at the Terry McAuliffe election, and they'll start to they'll continue in some places to defect on the issue towards parents as opposed to the special interests who have historically controlled them. And even in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker sucks in a lot of ways. Governor of Illinois, deep blue state. He was up by double digits in the polls. In 2022, he answered a candidate survey saying he would support the same school choice program that he vowed to eliminate back when he first ran in 2017. Now, look, you can say he didn't believe that. He even went on to Chicago Tribune the next year, and he told them that if a bill got to his desk to save the program, he would sign it. Now, it never got to his desk. He probably knew it was never going to get to his desk. But that you have high-profile Democrats feeling compelled to signal support for school choice, something that they would just usually repeat the teachers union talking points about. They're now feeling pressure. The heat has been turned up, and that's good news, whatever the reason, for families in the end, that politicians are feeling the heat.
Yeah. Well, something is changing when parents took back the school boards in San Francisco, some of the most liberal, progressive, Democrat strongholds in the country. In our final minutes together, tell us about your new book, The Parent Revolution.
Yes, The Parent Revolution, Rescuing Your Kids from the Radicals Ruining Our Schools. You can get it anywhere. Amazon's probably the easiest place. I believe it's 25% off right now. I don't know how long that's going to last, but get your copy. 25% off The Parent Revolution on Amazon or anywhere else. It's now a national bestseller, and I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but Donald Trump endorsed the book a couple of weeks ago, right before it became a national bestseller. So that was very helpful. I'm honored to have this endorsement. And Ted Cruz on the back of the book, if you want to take his advice, he endorsed it and said that, quote, you can ruin Randy Weingarten's day by reading this book.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm excited for people to read it and learn more. Was there one particular thing that as you researched and you wrote that really just, like, for lack of a better word, took your breath away or shocked you?
It shocked me just remembering how crazy things were during the COVID era with the school closures. So that there was a lot of things I was like, oh man, that actually happened. And so it's a very beautiful, if I may add, recounting of the facts and making sure the other side is never going to be able to rewrite history on this issue. But then also just seeing the trend of how it's become a GOP litmus test issue, the issue of parental rights in education, that if you're in a Republican primary and you vote against parental rights in education, you're probably going to lose your seat. In Tennessee, for example, 10 of the so-called Republicans running for the House in 2022 in Tennessee were endorsed or funded by the teachers unions. 9 of them lost. Again, another political earthquake. And look, it's surprising to me because we've fought for school choice for a long time, and we've been having lackluster results, just incremental reform kind of here and there every couple of years. We've gone from 0 to 100 real quick on the issue, and it's not because we had any better arguments for it. We've always had good arguments for it. The logic has always been sound, and the facts and data have always been on our side. But now we have a new political juggernaut that has entered the scene. They're called parents. They're the union for the kids. And guess what? They care about their kids more than anybody else, certainly more than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. And so when they lock arms, when they band together, it's shocking how much of a political force to be reckoned with that they can be. And it's just beautiful to see a lot of the stuff that I called in the book is playing out before our eyes right now. I kind of called what was going to happen in Texas. We've seen this movie before in Iowa. The running joke in Iowa is that the Democrats should have voted for the pared down version of school choice that Governor Reynolds was first pushing in 2022. It was a good bill, but it was only like 3,000 kids who would have benefited. The House blocked it after the Senate passed it. And the result was that they got a new House. Voters held the politicians accountable. They got a more conservative House, and they passed full-throated universal school choice right away in January 2023. It's happening in Texas right now. We've seen this movie before. Abbott, most recently, the governor of Texas, who's a staunch education freedom fighter, he went on local media telling the reporter that, there was a lot of goodies included for the status quo in that bill last year. I don't know if that same deal is going to be on the table. So I think it's almost a blessing in disguise that when we fail at first, the unions can slow down the march towards education freedom, but they're never going to be able to stop it because it's such a popular issue. And the laboratories of democracy right now, it's a beautiful thing to see, are kind of outmaneuvering each other, engaging in friendly competition to empower families. So we're going to continue in this direction.
Oh, that's awesome. I love what you said, that parents are the union for the children, and they need that advocate. And it's the parents being involved, understanding what's being taught or sometimes pushed on their children helps us avoid government failure factories, and turn them into actual places of learning where these burgeoning minds can grow and cultivate and be the next generation that we need them to be. So I appreciate everything that you are doing for kids, for parents, for the country. I'm going to put a direct link to your book down below so that people can go get it and learn more. If people want to follow you online, Corey, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can go on X, formerly Twitter. It's just my last name, first name. It's at DeAngelis Corey.
Okay, I'll put a direct link for that down below as well. Thank you so much for coming on. I know you're traveling and meeting with parents and schools all over the country, so I appreciate you taking a little bit of time for us. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity.